Are you ready to jumpstart your next big idea? Then welcome to the Niche Pursuits podcast. It's all about helping you find your niche, getting the motivation and strategies you need, and growing your ideas into something real. Hey everyone, it is Spencer here with nichepursuits.com, and today I'm excited to share with you an interview with Stacy Caprio, and her website is her.ceo. That's where you can go to check out what she's doing, join her email newsletter, and get her strategies as well. But before I introduce the interview itself, I want to give you a heads up that I did not conduct this interview. It's actually conducted by Jake Kane, and you'll quickly find that out as soon as you hear his voice here in a second. But why Jake? Well, you may remember Jake. He's been a co-host on the Niche Pursuits podcast several times. He's actually been a guest where we talk about his story a couple of different times, I think, with successful websites that he has. And he was one of the coaches for Niche Site Project 3, where he coached a student, Ryan Spadafora, along the way, where I believe we posted all of those episodes as podcast episodes as well, in addition to videos on YouTube. And so Jake is well known in the Niche Pursuits community. He's a super smart guy. He does really, really well with his websites. Even though it's not about Jake here, I just want to let you know that the host of this particular episode, the interview that he does, he's very knowledgeable. He's built very successful websites, and maybe even more importantly, he's just a great guy. And I hate to admit it, but maybe even more lovable than me, if that's possible, right? No, Jake's a great guy. We have a great relationship, but he is kind of stepping in for me here on this episode and maybe a couple of more episodes here in the near future, and I can dive into that more. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. I'm still part of Niche Pursuits, but Jake's just helping me out here for a little bit. But I think you're going to enjoy this interview with Stacy. She talks about her journey of buying and selling websites, and she really actually loves Flippa a lot. And I'll let her explain that here in the interview, but that's where she's found her deals, where she went from working a full-time job to quitting her job to building and scaling her website. She talks about the strategies that she uses to not only find the deals, but how to scale those websites. So there's a lot of great takeaway tips, and it really is a great interview with Jake and Stacy. So I'll let them take it away, and I hope that you really enjoy this episode. Again, to follow along with Stacy and what she is doing, go to her.ceo. Again, that's her.ceo. Thanks again for listening.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Niche Pursuits podcast. My name is Jake Kane. I am filling in for the irreplaceable Spencer Halls. And for some of you who may remember, if you've been listening to the show for a long time, I used to work for Spencer full-time for several years. And so I co-hosted several podcasts with Spencer, have been a guest on the show. And now I'm doing a little bit of pinch hitting for Spencer here and running the Niche Pursuits podcast for today. And so I'm really excited about that. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening. We've got Stacy Caprio. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly as our guest today. Stacy, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well, Jake. Thanks for hosting me today.
Absolutely. We're excited to do this. So Stacy has a pretty interesting story that I think a lot of folks listening to the show today will relate with. So I'm really excited to get into that. But Stacy, if you would, just starting out, give everybody a little bit of background on you and sort of where you're from and kind of the things, the businesses that you're into today and sort of what you got going on. And then we'll kind of dive into the beginning of the story.
Sounds great. So I went to college at Boston College, and I got my first job at an e-commerce paid ad online marketing agency. So I was always on the paid ad side of things, and that's where I got my start. And then I moved to an agency that did Pinterest and Facebook ads for venture funded companies. And then finally, I moved to like a financial services company running their paid ads. And I think I always knew that I didn't want to work for someone else for my entire life. Like I've always had more of an entrepreneurial spirit. I think I really enjoy having autonomy in my day and just freedom to direct my day as I want it to be directed. Another thing about the 9 to 5 is you're so capped in terms of your salary and in terms of even if you completely double the revenue of a business, your salary wouldn't double or anything. So it's very different from us, owning the online businesses and being able to get out what you put into it. So I think that was something that really attracted me to the online business space initially.
Yeah, cool. So what kind of business are you in, or like what are you doing? Like what's your business do today? Like how are you making a living right now?
I make my main income from 2 of my sites that kind of work together, and that's my main focus. I bought one of the sites on Flippa and created one of the sites myself. And then I'm also currently working actually on an e-commerce site project and growing that. It's currently at a few hundred a month, but I really like that it has a really strong brand and that people are really connected to the product and that I can be connected to the customer. And it's just really different than the ad-based sites that I've done before. So I'm hoping I can also grow that to a point just because it's not as reliant on Google either. And so I like having something with a stronger brand and customer base in that way.
Yeah. So your other sites that are not e-commerce, they're making money through just like digital ads, or are you doing like affiliate stuff too? Or is that sort of the model that you're following?
Yeah, they mostly make money off of ads and different ad platforms. I'm not as drawn to affiliate sites just because you make such a small commission. I almost think, why not just make it into an e-commerce site at that point?
Okay.
So I've never, and also with all the recent penalties and then the Amazon affiliate cut too, I think I'm glad that I've never been as drawn to them.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I was having this conversation via email yesterday with somebody on this similar thing. And I sort of said the opposite as far as like, I said, one thing I love about affiliates is that you don't have any customers. And so, because they were sort of having this debate, I was like, no returns. Because I had an Amazon business as well where I had products and things, and it wasn't terrible by any means, but at the same time, to me, it's kind of nice that like, I can just refer you to somebody else and then you sign up, and if you don't like the product, like I don't have to hear from those folks again. But that's sort of interesting, but very cool. So tell me a little bit. I read your story a little bit on your site, and it sounds like, to me, it sounded like me, first of all, the way you described being in a cubicle and just feeling kind of trapped, and you ran what sounds like a comfortable job. So, relative to a lot of people, it's not like this was some horrible situation, but at the same time, just like you said, you're sort of capped on where you can go with that. And it's just all of those things. And I remember feeling those emotions myself. And, I would listen to shows like this, the Niche Pursuits podcast at lunch, and just like, what am I doing? I got to figure out a way out of this. And so I just have a feeling that a lot of people listening to this show right now are in a similar boat. So tell us a little bit of the background on that and kind of where you were at. And then sort of you can get into like, what took you from there to like, how did you get started even thinking about doing online stuff? Like, was it a certain book you were following? Like, how did you get down the rabbit hole and get the whole thing started?
Yeah, I felt exactly the same way that you feel, and probably a lot of these listeners feel, where you just feel like there's so much more and that you can have more control over your day and over your business. And even just something as simple as being able to feel like the sun on your face in the middle of a day, like you don't have that luxury when you're in a 9 to 5. And it's actually a really funny story. Part of the reason I was so excited to be on this podcast is I first heard about website investing and Flippa on the Niche Pursuits blog.
Okay.
So that was actually the only reason I even knew that website investing and Flippa existed. And I remember reading about it. Yeah, like probably on my lunch break at work or something, like scrolling on my computer. I loved reading the blog. At that point, I never listened to podcasts because I thought they were a waste of time. But clearly my views have changed. I remember reading that and it inspired me so much that weekend. I actually went home and I scrolled through hundreds of listings on Flippa. And I actually ended up finding the first site that I bought. It was,
Wow.
yeah. And that was what got me started on this whole path. So I'm grateful for this podcast and the Niche Pursuits blog. I actually, in every other podcast I've been on and every blog post I write, I pretty much mention Niche Pursuits and the blog just because that's what inspired me.
Okay.
But once I read that, I bought a site. It was for sale for $1,300. The owner said it was making $350 profit a month. And at this point, I didn't know how to verify that. I didn't know how sites really made money. I didn't know what the industry standards were for page views and all of that. So it was actually an Amazon associate site. And I mean, I looked at analytics, I looked at screenshots, but the seller, he was falsifying everything. Like he showed me his whole account instead of just the one site. And I didn't realize that until after I had bought it because I just didn't have experience with it. And I just blindly trusted him. So I ended up buying it and it was only making like $20 to $50 a month, which I recently realized is actually, it's technically like a 30 to 65 times multiple. So like people in today's market would have bought it if you'd been honest about it.
Right.
That was like 5 years ago. So the average was a 20 times monthly profit multiple.
Yeah.
But to me, it was just really disheartening to see that he had been lying about it. And so I pretty much ended up giving up on that site and moving on from there. But other than that, I would never have even tried investing in websites. So it was a good lesson to learn not to trust people and take things at face value. Right.
Yeah. So you started learning about it. It sounds like very quickly decided, hey, I'm going to buy this site.
Yeah.
It turns out to be a lemon. Like, this guy basically lied about what I was making. And then you, at some point, decided to give up on it. And then what'd you do? Like go out and buy another site, or like, what was the next step? Obviously you didn't quit right there, which is good. I think a lot of people would have been like, this is a scam, I'm going to figure something else out. But it sounds like you went on and what'd you do after that?
Yeah, I think I took the responsibility on myself as opposed to saying, oh, the whole site's a scam, because I knew that it could still make money because I got like the 20 to 50 a month. And I was like, oh, this is cool. It actually works. Yeah. So I think it inspired me in that way. But I was still dejected and it took me months to actually work up the nerve to buy a different site. But I had been learning and reading case studies like the Niche Pursuits blog and the other types of things. And I ended up buying another site. It was a lot more expensive than my first site, but I had a good handle on things and I really knew how to verify the revenue. And I knew I could quickly double the revenue of this site. Like I knew different ad networks that would really provide a better return. So I bought it and I was able to do all of that, quickly double the revenue. It was making $500 a month when I bought it. And then I put in a different ad network and was able to take it to $1,000 a month. But this one ended up, it was like a fad site. So the traffic ended up tanking shortly after. So I made back the majority of it, but not even all of it. But at that point, I was a little bit hooked because I knew it definitely worked. I'd seen somebody making $1,000 at this point.
Yeah.
So after that, I went on to buy another site. This one ended up doing really well. In less than 2 years, I was able to make back 400% of the money I'd put in.
Okay.
So at this point, I saw my sites doing really well. And I had bought my first 3 while I was still at my 9 to 5.
Yeah.
And then the fourth set I bought, I actually was when I left my 9 to 5 and I was able to live with my grandma. She's now 95. She was like 91. Yeah. She's so healthy and strong and she's the most loving person, but she let me live with her while I was growing my business, because when I left my job, I was only making $1,000 a month from the third site purchase at this point.
Yeah.
And I was able to live with her. And because I saved money on rent, I was able to make my fourth site purchase, which is where it made more money than all the other sites. And that was what really enabled me to to move out of my grandma's a year later and live like in my dream apartment in Chicago. You can see the beautiful background.
I was going to say, like, your background here, like, I don't know. I'm not a big Zoom expert. Unless this is like fake. I was like, you look like you're just like, you got like a penthouse apartment now. Like, where is this story headed?
No, it's not a penthouse, but it's
on Michigan Avenue.
Yeah, you can actually, the bean is like right back there. I don't know if you can see it though in this view, but it's like a beautiful view, and I like the floor to ceiling windows and everything. It's like a studio, so my bed's like right over there, and everything. But I love this apartment, and I love just the fact that I get to work on my own schedule each day and work on growing my own business and websites. So it's really been such a blessing, and it's awesome to be able to do what we do each day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's cool. I just thought, I was like, you started talking about your apartment. I was like, if we turn this into like a tour of your apartment, like a HGTV spin on this, like I'm definitely getting
cribs or something.
Spencer here's this recording. He's like, what in the world happened here? I'm talking about Chicago real estate. But anyway, no, that's very cool. So when you were buying the second site, third site, fourth site, like, you don't have to reveal the sites or whatever, but like, how much were you spending? Like, obviously the first site you bought that was kind of a scam was very cheap. Like, how did you scale up from there? Like, either the exact dollar amounts or maybe just a range of like, what were you buying these sites for? How much did they cost? And was it just cash you'd saved up, or were you like borrowing money? Like, how did you make all of that happen?
Great question. So I can give you exact dollar amounts. I don't mind sharing that. The first one was the 1,300. I bought them all just with money I'd saved in cash. To me, I don't like the idea of taking out a loan or making a risk that could dig me into a hole for my future, because I'm doing all of this for my future self. So if I did something and then it put me in a worse position where I was even more obligated to a 9-to-5, I think I would feel horrible about myself. So I wouldn't feel comfortable taking out a loan for that type of thing. But the second site I had bought for $10,000, and it was making the $500 a month when I bought it. And then I was able to quickly increase it to $1,000 a month. But then the traffic had dropped off of that a few months later. And then the third one, which was the first one that I got the 400% return on, I had purchased for $6,400.
Okay.
So it started off making like $240 a month. And then I added in a different ad network and was able to take it to like $600 a month. And it kind of increased from there. And then I also had someone reach out to me because they wanted to put a banner ad on the site.
Okay.
So I did that, and that was an extra $500 a month. So I brought it up to like over $1,000 a month, which was pretty cool. And that was the one when I left my 9-to-5, I still had bringing in income. And then the fourth site I purchased while I was at my grandma's. And I think it's funny because I probably wouldn't have had the cash to buy it if I'd been renting an apartment at that time.
Yeah.
I'd been living with her. So that's kind of cool. It's like maybe her gift to me was the fourth site pretty much, which I paid $18,000 for. So that was the most expensive site, and it was making $1,800 a month when I bought it. So I actually got it at like a really great multiple, but I think it had a penalty in the past. And so I had reached out to the owner. It actually hadn't sold on Flippa. And I reached out to him years later and made the offer, and he accepted. And so that was the site that I ended up really scaling, and that enabled me to really get the financial independence.
Wow. Very cool. So now, how much did grandma understand about what you were doing while you're living with grandma? Like, because I have these conversations a lot. I'm not even talking about with grandparents. I'm talking with
everyone,
spouses. Like, what is it? Like, how are we making money? That sort of thing. Like, I'm just curious, did grandma, like, she sort of get what you're doing, or is she like, honey, you need to go find a job. You can't live here forever. Like, what was she sort of being encouraging, or just bewildered by the whole thing? Like, how did that work?
I know exactly what you're talking about. Anytime I tell people what I do, they're like, what? Like, they just get this look in their eyes. Like you can tell it's not fully translating. So it's always refreshing to talk to people who like fully grasp it, who have the experience of it. And one thing I really love about having lived with my grandma was she actually grew up singing in a band with her sisters, and her whole family was so musical. And then she actually toured in her early 20s, like singing on the road and doing all of that. So she knew what it was like to do something that you loved. Yeah. And she taught all of her children. She had 8 children, and one of them is my mom, to like do what they love. And like my mom was an artist in Chicago, actually. And she also taught like fitness classes. So, and like all of my grandma's kids do stuff that they really love. So I think she loved and she understood that I was doing something that I really enjoyed and got joy from. And she understood that. So she was always really happy that I was pursuing my dream in that way. It's actually funny. She gives really good business advice. Like every night at 9 p.m., we would have a business discussion and I would share my results with her. Yeah. But she would always say she didn't fully understand like how it worked or how it was monetized. Pretty similar to like most of our experience talking to people who aren't in this world. They just don't have a grasp on it. But she business-wise, she would give me advice and tips and we would talk about results. So she grasped it probably more than most people.
Well, that's good. Yeah. It's always good to have somebody that's, at least supporting what you're trying to do around, because it can be a lonely road if you're, just a solo whoever that's doing this and nobody in your day-to-day sort of gets what you're doing. And everybody's like, oh, that sounds weird, or whatever. Yeah. It can be a little deflating because a lot of times it takes a while to see any results. I did that for years where it was like, you're staying up late doing this stuff and not making any money. And it's like, it can be a little disheartening. So that's pretty cool that you have somebody in your family that's done some creative stuff that's like, hey, good with it. That's very cool. I will also say too, for me, have you ever been to any like conferences at all, like blogger conferences or digital marketing conferences or anything since you've been sort of doing this stuff? Like, have you been to any live events like that?
Yeah, just a handful. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know about you, but for me, we went when I was working for Spencer, we went a couple of times to an event called Traffic and Conversion Summit by the digital marketer guys in California. And it was that moment for me where it was like, you realize how many things, because just like you said, like, just the language that you use and the things you talk about, like nobody in my life talks about that stuff, And so just to be like in live events and like circles of people that you're kind of having lunch with and stuff, and you're sort of talking about the same things like on page SEO and all these little things, it was the craziest thing. So I just throw that out there to say, not necessarily to plug that conference, which it was great. Somebody's listening who's kind of teetering, and you have the opportunity as live events are sort of coming back a little bit to go to something like that. To me, it was super energizing, if anything, just to be in a room full of people that are all kind of in that world. Obviously you learn a lot, but it's a great place to network and just feel like you're a part of a community. I thought it was pretty cool, but anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. So when you were doing these sites, then you bought a few sites and you're working out of grandma's house for a little bit. Were you doing all the work yourself? I mean, so far I've heard you say that you were upgrading the advertising network. I don't know if you want to mention which network you prefer or what you're using for that. If so, please go ahead. But besides that, were you doing anything else? Like, were you adding content? And if so, were you writing the content? Like, what was going on there? Like, how were you getting stuff done?
I did pretty much everything myself other than development type work because I'm not a developer. And I like doing it myself simply because I found that anytime I've paid or outsourced the work, the SEO or the content or just the normal day-to-day work, the keyword research, I don't think people care as much as you do. And I think you get what you maybe pay for, and you pretty much pay for the bare minimum unless you pay a lot more. And even then, I don't think the people really care as much. So I've never seen as good of results or as good of content just from hiring people, which is part of why I like to do it myself. But another reason that I like to do it myself is simply because then you get to keep all the profits. And I like to take that. I actually don't reinvest it into my website. I don't know what you usually do, but I know a lot of people like to pour it back in.
Yeah.
But I found that websites are riskier just due to my own experience and seeing the landscape over the years. So I like to just reinvest it in other types of investments like stocks. And I actually recently bought a duplex in like near Austin, Texas. So
Okay.
I like to put it into different types of things because I feel like that way you're diversifying and you can set up for your future self, just knowing that you'll have income in different ways, even if your websites don't work out.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's cool. Good for you. That's probably a smart move. Yeah. I'm to the point now. I mean, I own close to 10 websites probably that are, producing some level of income with a big difference between the best and the worst. And, I definitely reinvest. I pretty much outsource everything at this point as far as content and stuff, but you're exactly right that was a struggle, to get that early on, like figuring out, you go through a lot of like bad writers and then just figuring out like how to get back the content that you're expecting and all of those things. There's a bit of a learning curve, but if you're somebody that's going to be writing or running multiple sites, you get to a point to where you're your own bottleneck. If you're really trying to grow and add content, it's like, especially if you're working too, and this is like what you're moonlighting at, it's hardly possible to keep moving it forward. So it's one of those things that eventually I think you kind of make the leap. But yeah, like you, I've sort of taken some of the money and diversified into some things, real estate and things like that. And I think it's a smart move, but yeah, very cool. Very cool. So how did you know, one thing I was going to ask you, so it sounds like you had a great situation where you had moved in with your grandma and that sort of thing, and you had that flexibility. But for somebody who's out there now that's kind of like making a little bit of money at this and they really want to quit their job because they're tired of it and that sort of thing, what advice would you give them on when do you think is the right time to step away from your job? Or how did you know? Because that's a pretty big leap. Like there's a lot of, whether it's real or imagined security that a lot of people feel about having a real job and their, benefits and things like that. So there's a lot that goes into it. How did you know it was the right time? And then what do you tell other people that may be sort of feeling like, hey, I'm getting close, but I don't know when I should make the leap?
For me, I just knew that it was time, that I had to give myself the chance to do it. And it was counterintuitive in the sense I was only making $1,000 a month when I decided to leave. And what I would tell people is you'll know when it's time, but also don't go into debt doing this. So if your living expenses are higher than what you're bringing in, don't do it. Like wait until you're making more than your living expenses. I was lucky in the sense I had my grandma to live with, who was letting me live with her. So my living expenses were slashed to almost nothing, just even my dinners like I would have with her and everything. So in that sense, I would say if all of a sudden you're quitting your job and now you have a family to support or you still have your rent and it's more than you're making, I would say don't dip into your savings even. As long as your cash outflow is like an equivalent of zero, I think you're fine. But if you start getting negative, I would say you're not setting it up for the best version of your future self. So I think you should always think about your future self and how you can set up your life the best for them. And so in that case, you might want to keep working at your job until you can raise the income.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I just sharing my story on that briefly. I had a site that I sold for a pretty good amount of money at the time, and I was working for Spencer, so it wasn't like working in the cubicle. Like it was a pretty good thing, right? And he was very supportive, and I was able to kind of phase out of that job, which was great. But for me, selling off an asset like a website and then being able to put away like a decent chunk of money in the bank made me feel really confident that like, hey, I've still got some other sites that were making money. And so I'm covering my bills, like you said, but I've also got a little bit of a nest egg here to where if it goes to zero tomorrow and Google just de-indexes my site, right? Like I've got a year or two or whatever that is to where we're going to be okay while I find another job and go back into it. So I think having, at least for me, that was a big peace of mind thing. Like even if I had my bills covered by what I was averaging every month from my sites, if I didn't have a big runway where I'm always thinking worst case scenario, if this thing goes to zero and I'm scrambling to pay my mortgage next month. Like that's a real problem. So I think that's maybe something to think about too. If you're on the edge, like you said, reducing expenses. I mean, these are kind of basic, right? But it's things to be thinking about, reducing like your fixed expenses that you have, and then also building up that savings, I think is really important. So you're not sweating bullets every month, hoping that you make enough from your website to pay your basic necessities. So I think I saw in your notes that you've sold. So you mentioned buying a few sites, and you've also sold at least one site, or have you sold multiple sites?
I've sold one site,
Okay.
the third site that I purchased for the 6,400.
Yeah.
And then I grew it over like a two-year period. And I ended up wanting to sell it. It was actually a super hands-off site. I didn't have to touch it, and it just hummed along with traffic and revenue.
Wow.
So you might be wondering, oh, then why would you want to even sell something like that? Because it was a forum-based site, so I didn't have to supply content, and it had a really dedicated user base. So people would come to it and they would visit it on their own every day, which insulated it from Google a bit, but it also had a lot of Google traffic, and it just hummed along on its own. There were admins that loved it, and they handled everything themselves, like the moderation and all of that. But I ended up wanting to sell it because at the end of the day, you can't control what people post on your site, and you can't control if it's copyrighted content or if it's inappropriate or whatever it may be. So I didn't want that responsibility anymore. And I thought it was just too much of a risk for me to take on. So I really wanted to sell it. And I ended up selling it through, have you heard of Latonis.com?
I have not.
It's a broker. They have a bunch of sites they sell, and they also have an audience, and they email things out to them. So this was before I had the Her CEO site. So I couldn't sell it to my own list, which I'm sure people would have bought it today. But I ended up selling it. The first person who got in a call with me, he wanted to buy it, and he made an offer. I actually ended up transferring him the entire site, the domain, and everything. And then he sent us an email. Oh, and he had the money in escrow. And he sent an email saying, I actually don't want to buy it anymore. And his excuse was that it didn't fit all the GDPR requirements, like it needed a controller or something, like a full-time employee running GDPR. I don't even know. But I think it was just an excuse. Like sometimes people maybe get cold feet about buying a website after they've put the money in escrow. So that was interesting. So he ended up just giving it back to me. And he got the money back from escrow, even though he'd signed all his contracts and everything. So I sold it to the second person who made an offer, and that ended up going through and everything. So that was an interesting process.
Yeah. Wow. So it was through the second person though, it was a pretty smooth process. Like no big moments where you're like, oh crap, I didn't think about this. Or was it like how hard was it to finish the transaction?
That's an interesting question. It was a very smooth process, but the whole time I had a bad gut feeling about this person.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't really on top of it, and it didn't seem like he could handle the site. But I thought, well, it doesn't matter because I'm selling it to him. It's not like when you're buying a site and you have to be sure they're telling the truth.
Right.
But a year later, I get an email from him, and he hadn't logged in once to check if the revenue was going into his bank account. And it turns out it wasn't. So the site was humming along and just depositing money into his account like it always had for me. And apparently the money had still been going into my account, and I didn't really think about it because I had another site with the advertiser. So I just thought that my other site was doing well. I mean, I didn't really look closely at it because it wasn't my biggest revenue site anyway.
Yeah.
And so it ended up being a whole thing. This is like a year later, and I had to give like over $4,000 back to the ad network so they could give it to him. But it just goes to show that I probably should have listened to my gut in that instance and sold it to someone who was more on top of things. But it ended up being fine. It's just interesting that he wouldn't even have logged in to check that once in a year time period.
Right. Wow. That's pretty crazy. So did you, if you don't care to share, like what is your preferred ad network, or do you use multiple ad networks? Like who have you had good experiences with?
The main two that I have actually used are just AdSense and Monumetric. And then I've worked with some private networks, like people who've reached out to put banner ads and that type of thing. And I've had a few smaller networks, but I don't really recommend or use them that much.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you take over a site that was maybe using AdSense and then move it to Volumetric, and it would just instantly increase like your RPMs and stuff like that?
Yeah, I did that on 2 of the sites that I was able to like quickly double the revenue.
Yeah.
One of the sites I actually just added Volumetric, so I still had AdSense running, and the other one I just switched it out. So there's a lot you can do with different ad networks in that sense. Yeah.
Okay. And then what else? I mean, the forum site is interesting because I would have never thought even really about buying a forum site. But that's pretty cool. I mean, I could see how that would just, like you said, like if it has an active participating network of folks, like it just sort of, like they're creating the content for you, which is kind of cool. For your other sites that were not forum sites, besides switching out the ads, I mean, what strategies were you using relative to keyword research or just whatever? Like, what's your plan? Like if you take over a site, let's just say you bought a site today that was making $500 a month, like, do you kind of have a list of things that you're going through that here's what I'm looking to do? Like, what do you do when you take over a site?
I usually have a short-term and a long-term SEO plan. And I've really found that just changing some of the structure of the site and then also doing like internal linking, such as like Spencer's Link Whisper, or I usually do it manually actually, because I'll go through the keywords and see which ones need help. But I found that just those types of changes, so basically the structure and internal linking, can give you a huge boost relatively quickly with SEO. And then also just making a long-term plan where you do the keyword research and you have a list of all the keywords that you want to target. And then you just start writing content for that. Or if you outsource it, which I usually don't do, you can outsource that type of thing.
Yeah.
And then publishing that over time, I found has actually been the best way I've found and the most effective way to actually grow the sites. Like that's what I did with the 4th site I purchased that really enabled it to grow in terms of traffic and revenue. So I think a lot of people want those quick wins, like the doubling the ad revenue from changing ad networks, or the quick SEO wins, because those are more fun and instant. But I think you really need to take a long-term approach and think about creating content and what you're going to do over time to increase the traffic and the revenue.
Yeah. Okay. So just diving into the weeds a little bit, because I would imagine most people listening to this podcast are people that are building a site or have a site or whatever. They're in this world. So like for your short-term stuff, like you mentioned Link Whisper, or you do some of it manually. Like, can you talk about, just briefly get into the weeds, I guess, on like how you go about attacking that? Like, where do you start? Like, what are you looking for? Like, as far as content to build internal links to, and how do you do it? Like, do you have any like little shortcuts or anything that somebody else maybe could use and implement on their site to do a better job with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend to, so I'd pull up the Google Analytics and also like Ahrefs, and then just look at the pages that are already getting the most traffic. If you go to like the acquisition report in Google Analytics, and you can look at landing pages, that's one of my favorite reports. And you can kind of see which pages are already getting traffic. And then you can also go to the Search Console and make sure you see which pages are on which keywords and which pages are ranking like page 1, but maybe lower. And then also page 2 to 5. And then also just pull up Ahrefs to check what they're measuring as what your keywords are ranking for. So then once you have all of that data, also pull up a keyword tool. Like I use the Google AdWords keyword tool to get keyword volume, and throw in like all your top pages and all the keywords into that, and then see which have the most volume. And you kind of have an idea of what the potential is. So keywords with a lot of volume that are page 2 to 5, and maybe they have some traction already, I would isolate those and then figure out if you can put them in your menu or link to them internally and keep track of it all in a spreadsheet. So you can tell how much link power you're giving to each of them, and then put the date that you do it. And then a few weeks later, you can check in and see if it shifted their rankings at all. So that's what I found to be most helpful. And it's really great because you can push keywords from that Google is already giving some rankings to, but they're maybe page 2 to 5 or lower on page 1, and then you can push it all the way to page 1. So that's one of the most actually effective things that I found in terms of like internal linking.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you've got a pretty, I don't know if complicated is the right word, but at least like an in-depth way that you go about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think I do it more in depth just so I can get a full picture, but I think if you want to do it more quickly, you can just pull up the search console and then just look pages 2 to 5 at the keywords, and then just see how much volume those keywords are getting, and then just link internally to the ones with the higher volume that are page 2 to 5. So like that's a very simplified version, but I like to just pull up more data sources just to be sure. But I think you can do it more simply in that way.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Okay. So if you see like, let's just say something you're on page 4, do you ever come and you look at like, sometimes I'll find that I'm accidentally ranking for keywords. In other words, like I'm on page 4 for an article that's kind of about that. And we could make up an example here. Right. But really, I haven't even like talked about that specific. A lot of times it'll be like a really specific phrase or question or something like that will be the keyword. And I've not really addressed that thing. So do you ever find yourself, in addition to adding internal links, also going back and updating the content, like when you're doing the same process? Or is it just, you're finding that, hey, if I just add some internal links, maybe with the right anchor text or something like that, that's enough to move the needle without going back and actually editing or making the content better?
That's a great point, actually. I've had the same experience where you see on page 5, it's ranking for a specific keyword, and you're like, well, I wasn't even targeting that in the post, which is actually kind of fun because for me, I find that as an opportunity to create a new piece of content around that keyword specifically. I would never try to boost or internally link a page that was ranking for a specific keyword if it wasn't optimized for that keyword, just because I would feel that would be not giving it its full potential.
Yeah.
So in that case, I would make a new piece of content with that keyword and like the URL and the title, and just make sure it's throughout the content a little bit. And then you could even internally link from the page that's ranking from that keyword to the new one. That's probably what I would do. But I would never try to push the ranking on a page if it wasn't optimized for a keyword, just because I think you're leaving a lot of the potential on the table. So that was a good thing to look at. Yeah.
Okay. And then on the keyword research front, which you mentioned, like when you're deciding on new content to do, I mean, do you have anything that you can share there as far as just little tips and tricks? You mentioned some of the tools that you're using, but outside of maybe just the basics that people are familiar with, like, do you have any little, I hate the word hacks, but like anything, like that you've just sort of discovered that really helps you find some good keywords that maybe other people could use or take a look at?
Yes, actually, I have a process that's pretty easy that I tend to use this for my keyword research. I use first I'll draft a list of keywords and then put them into the Google Keyword Planner just to get the volume to see what even has potential. Mm-hmm. And then I'll pull up Chrome and I'll use the Moz Chrome extension. And that shows you like the DA and the PA of all the sites on page 1. Yeah. So then I'll put each keyword that I think has volume potential into the Google search bar. And then you'll be able to see the domain authority and the page authority for the pages already ranking on page 1 for that keyword. And then I'll use the extension to find the domain authority and the page authority of the site I'm doing the research for. Mm-hmm. And then you can compare and say, oh, does my site have potential to rank on that page? Or is it completely overshadowed by huge players in the game? And I think one thing to be cognizant of when you're doing that is if huge players like Forbes or other big sites are ranking for it, you should look if they're targeting your specific keyword. Yeah. Because if they're targeting a general keyword, you might still be able to outrank them.
Yeah. No, that's really good.
Yeah.
I like doing that too. And that's,
Yeah.
you're exactly right. You find that sometimes, like if you really can laser focus on the query, that you can beat some of the big guys, which is always
It's
fun.
kind of fun, to see your little page ranking.
Right. That's the best.
Yeah.
So you've bought several sites, I guess. Just a couple more questions as we get ready to wrap up. But what would you say for somebody that's never bought a site before? I mean, do you like Flippa? Like, where else are you looking? And then just, I guess, in general, for somebody that's thinking about maybe going down that road, like, what are some of your key things that you've learned that you would advise somebody who's out there just kind of looking like, hey, I may want to buy a site. I've never done it before. You know what I'm saying? Like, what's just some of the big pieces of advice you'd give people as far as finding deals and knowing whether or not it's a site worth buying?
Yes. So I usually look on Flippa. I've actually bought every site that I've ever bought through Flippa, other than one I did through a private deal.
Mhm.
But I really would recommend Flippa. I love the fact that it is a user marketplace where anyone can post and anyone can buy. That does open it up to a lot of the scam and the fraud that we talked about. But I think a buyer should always take it upon themselves to be filtering those things out. So I just like it because you can find the best deals. And personally, this is actually something I would recommend to people. Never buy a site based on its potential. So only buy it based on what it's currently making. If you wouldn't be okay with it just making that, you probably shouldn't buy it. The exception to that, and something that I also recommend, is you do need a plan and you need to see something in the site that you can greatly improve, whether that is switching the ad network, SEO quick wins or long wins, like we talked about. There should be something that you see in it that the current owner doesn't see, where you can quickly double revenue and also increase the revenue over time. So personally, I would never buy a site unless I thought I could make the revenue back in a year or less. And I think that's important for everyone to establish their own criteria for that. Like, how long are they willing to wait, and also what their plan for the site is. So I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind when you're buying a site. I would say you can also look on Latonis. You can look on sites like Empire Flippers, although they tend to have higher multiples.
Yeah.
And Motion Invest has some good sites. Also, don't discount private, like Facebook groups where people post things.
Yeah.
And just building relationships with people who you've bought sites with in the past. Sometimes they'll reach out to you saying, I have a new site to sell, that type of thing. I think can be really beneficial. Oh, and the HerSEO email list you can sign up for. I'll send out some deals to you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll wrap up in just a second, and you can kind of people can get on that list and sort of what you're doing there. I was going to say, you brought up a great point about staying connected with people you bought from before. There's a lot of times, I've probably bought, I don't know, at least half a dozen sites at this point, and I really enjoy doing it. I've got the same guy who I bought 2 sites from now, who I connected with via Spencer somehow. And now he just Facebook Messenger. He's probably listening to this. Message him like, hey man, you interested in something like that? And before I know it, I'm in this conversation.
Just send me a site next time, not Jake.
I now own a site in whatever niche, that I knew nothing about. But I would add one thing to what you said, and I thought you brought up some great points, but something that I like to do when I'm looking at a site. Sometimes I always get really excited about ideas. I start seeing what I would do with it and all that. And before I know it, I can be too far gone and, sometimes don't make decisions based on the numbers. But I like using tools like Ahrefs or Ahrefs, or however you say it, to see what the ceiling is. And that's how I always advise people, because it's like, even if I see that I could switch out their ad network and let's say double revenue, maybe that's good enough for me. But is there room to grow, or is the topic so narrow that they've done kind of just about all the content there is to do? And for me, it's very simple. I can look in that tool, see who the competing domains are and who are the big guys, right? Like, and it'll, the traffic estimates aren't hugely accurate, but it's not really important. Like, am I able to see somebody that's getting approximately twice as much traffic, 3 times, 4 times, 10 times? And at least you kind of know going in, like, what's my content opportunity, and you can dig and do a little keyword research before you ever buy it to know, is this kind of tapped out, or do I still have, a lot of content that I can add to it. That's how I'm going into it, planning on investing in content. I just want to know that opportunity is there before I buy it. But that's some really good advice. So thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else that you'd like to share, I guess, before we wrap up? Again, I sort of mentioned at the beginning of your story, sitting in a cubicle. And again, I was in the same boat, like kind of, a job that's just fine and doing okay, but it's like, this isn't it. I mean, anything else that you would want to share in closing with somebody that maybe is listening to us today that's in that boat? I don't know. What advice would you give them? What inspirational type things? What would you leave them with?
I would tell them that they should go right now and register a domain and just buy some hosting, create a website, put one together themselves, and start experimenting with it. So read things like the Niche Pursuits blog or the podcast, and things like, I love Nick Loper's Side Hustle Nation, or John Dixtra's like Fat Stacks too.
Mm-hmm.
These are all blogs where people are actually in the weeds doing the case studies. And I found those types of things to be the most valuable. So I would say keep listening and reading, and then have your own site and just experiment. So anytime you hear something interesting, just do it on your own site. And this is a great risk-free way to just learn, and who knows, you might get some really good results at some point and be able to sell it or leave your job that way. But once you have enough experience, you can also buy a site at that point and grow it from there too.
Right. Yeah, no, I love that advice. You got to get doing something, right? Because you can just learn forever. And that's, a lot of people get stuck in that mode where you're always just consuming. And it's like, well, once I figure this out, I'll go ahead and get started. But it's like, I love what you said. Just get started today, and then you can figure it out as you go. I always tell people that are just starting a site, like, nobody's reading it anyway,
just your mom.
Try it, right? Like, nobody's like trying to get their design just perfect and things. And it's like, what are we doing here? Like, this is, you can figure that out when there's like a couple hundred people a day coming to the site, So yeah, I love it.
People get so caught up in the design or making it look perfect, but at the end of the day, it's more the functionality and the traffic. Like,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, no, I say that to folks all the time, like anybody that ever asks or whatever. It's like, the hard part is getting traffic to the site, like, you can always later on, like once you're making money, like you can hire a designer and all that stuff, like worry about everything later, like traffic first, and then figure out how to make money, but no, I think that's fantastic. So as we're wrapping up, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. I know you mentioned earlier, you've got an email list where you send out some people that are looking to sell their site, but what else you got going on over at Her CEO, and kind of what you're doing, and how can people, stay up to date with what you're doing and keep in touch with you and things like that?
Yeah, they can find me over at her.co, www.her.co, and I post my own journey and updates, and you can sign up for the email list and get periodic updates. And I also sometimes send out site deals and that type of thing. Also, you can email me stacy@her.co, and I love talking to you guys there. I currently update people, send the email list occasionally, and write new blog posts. I also recently started advertising on the email list. So if anyone who's interested in getting a spot can reach out to me. And I suppose I'm also doing some white hat link outreach for a few select people. I don't know how many more clients I want to take on, because I actually have like probably a handful right now. But if anyone is interested, you can email me and I'll see if it's a fit for that. But those are the main projects that I'm publicly doing with the Her CEO site.
Oh, very cool. Mm-hmm. Well, that's awesome. Well, congratulations on your success. Thank you for coming on the Niche Pursuits podcast. Thank you for being my first guest as the pinch hitter, keeping the chair warm here for Spencer for a little bit. So I appreciate that. But I really enjoyed our time. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you so much, Jake. The pleasure is all mine.